Mr. Smith. Maybe a couple of seconds and I will.
Hi, I'm Selwyn Manning and you are watching A View from Afar. And as always, we are joined by political scientist and former Pentagon analyst Paul Buchanan. And this week we are going to discuss how voting continues to be counted in the United States, with it being so very close but nudging slightly favourably for Democrat candidate Joe Biden. But incumbent US President Donald Trump, he's already claimed victory, and that the reason for this is that he is claiming there is voter fraud. He's also not going to allow them, as he says, to steal the election, and he intends to take this whole election, and particularly the voting counts in tipping states, to the United States Supreme Court. And overnight, Donald Trump has also filed lawsuits to stop counting in Michigan and Pennsylvania. Looks like he may not be successful in that, but let's talk to Paul about that in a short time. Meanwhile, the vote counting of votes is ongoing. The totals in the key tipping states, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, should be more clear, certainly by the end of today, particularly in the next 24 hours with respect to Pennsylvania. But first, here's an invitation to those of you who are joining us live. If you are joining us via Facebook, Twitter or YouTube, do feel free to make comments, because if you do, we'll be able to include those comments in our program. So let's cross to Paul, who is waiting online to unpick the complexities of this election outcome. Good afternoon, Paul.
Good afternoon, Selwyn, from a very wet and dreary Auckland West Coast.
It is. That matches the mood. Yeah, that matches the mood. It's inclement here on the Auckland side of the isthmus as well, Paul. Look, Paul, can you unpick this for us from the point of view of where you see it at the moment, who you believe is going to end up being the President of the United States, and also what that means and what route is there that is most likely for the eventual winner to take here?
Well, let me start out with by putting my political scientist hat on, just very briefly. And the reason I'm doing that is because, once again, we've seen that in spite of the methodological improvements to survey research, polling, in the wake of the 2016 election, the pollsters still have not gotten it right. And so, they've worked very hard to increase the sophistication of their pre-election polling, and yet we're left with a result that, quite frankly, may not have surprised the Trump White House. Maybe they know something that no one else knows, but certainly surprised people like me, who thought, well,
and myself, many others, millions of people.
But so, I think just from a political science standpoint, we just have to be increasingly skeptical of even the most sophisticated polls.
And the probability polls, obviously, we're not picking this up. And, with your political scientist hat on, what do you suspect is going on here? Is it the ground game that the pollsters are just not reaching into with people at that end?
I think it's the ground game in the red states. I think what's going on, and again, I'm not an expert in polling, but they consistently misread or underestimate the amount of support for Trump. The die-in-the-wool red convictions, whichever they may be. And, I don't know if that's because people in red states don't use advanced technologies, they don't play with cell phones and computers as much as people in the liberal bastions and urban areas in general. But it seems to me that most of the mistakes or the flaws are made with regards to the red states. I think we got the blue states more or less figured out. Again, the two coasts.
But then again, the polling in the tipping states, the most important states, for example, Michigan, even Wisconsin last night was not looking too flash for the Democrats, was it? Certainly Pennsylvania, these kind of things were showing on the scale of probabilities very favourable for Biden, but it ends up he's got a fight on his hands. So it's looking like it's edging toward him, but only with those early votes, the postal votes, etc., coming in and being counted accurately now. So do you think it may be that this long extended period of voting and the change in voting behaviours is indicating the inabilities of the election night results to show the overall picture, perhaps, where the polls may not have been accurate, but they weren't so far off in those states, and once everything has been counted. Sorry about the long-winded questions, but you get what I'm saying there, I think.
Yeah, I do, and I'll just finish with this. It struck me, I forget who the Republican pollster was, but a couple of weeks ago, someone on the red side of the polling equation said it's going to come down to the same three states as 2016. Now, that person is absolutely accurate. It's going to turn out to be the exact same three states. Whatever they were doing, it gave them a better read of the pulse in these so-called battlegrounds.
What stands out on that is the Rasmussen polls, for example, that were seen to be quite partisan toward the Republicans, particularly with Trump. But in some ways, when you look back retrospectively, perhaps they may have been over-egging it to a degree, but they were closer to it than some of the more supposed reliable polls in the whole mix. But having said that, we'll get to some of the states and the key states in a short moment here. What's your gut feeling relating to who is most likely to end up? It looks like Biden to me, but what's your thinking on that? And also, is it going to be his chance at taking the presidency here, is it going to be hampered by Donald Trump's intent to take this through the legal kind of channels?
The short answer to that is yes, but let me just back up and simply say this. I believe that Biden is going to win. And it's the second thing I was about to say, which is the importance of absentee ballots. The last, I'd say, 5 election cycles, and I vote absentee from here in Palm Beach County, Florida. And the absentee ballot is getting increasingly more important. And this year there was a lot of talk about the pandemic, and of course Trump brought up voter suppression. But the hard fact of the matter is that for the last 20 years, the percentage of absentee ballots, so-called mail-in ballots, has increased each and every election cycle. So I think what's going to happen, and we'll see if any of this occurs, regardless of who wins, the United States no longer can have an election day. Because it's not. What they may have to have is somewhat what we have here in New Zealand, which is an election period in which votes are counted, let's say on November 3rd, 2020, and the counting period is 48 hours, and the certification period is another 2 weeks, because as it stands now, the certification is, I believe, December 9th. It's a month out from now. But because there's so much problems with counting, because the technologies for counting have not kept up.
And it's not uniform over the patchwork of states across the United States, is it?
So, you've got manual counting that begins at the end of Election Day. And so, of course, that's a recipe for long delays. And I think that they're going to have to really think through that, yes, you have a nominal election day, again, as we do here, but that votes can be sent in before, and they're counted across the country, beginning on that election day, but with the assurance to the public that there's a window, a 48-hour window, or whatever time frame is deemed, and that way people will not be in the situation they are today, where you have one side saying, oh, it's fraud, and you can't count votes after Election Day, even though the law specifies that anything postmarked before Election Day or on Election Day can be counted after. Just to clarify it, and that way some of the tension about voter fraud after Election Day will be allayed.
On that point, shall we just this has been obviously well reported. This was Donald Trump last night, Paul. And I think you made sure that you stayed awake in New Zealand time to actually see what he was going to say. So let's just, for the viewers' sake, just play this and then speak to that point about what are the signals you make from all of this.
We want the law to be used in a proper manner. So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list, okay? It's a very sad moment. To me, this is a very sad moment, and we will win this, and as far as I'm concerned, we already have won it. So I just want to thank you, and I want to thank all of our support. I want to thank all of the people that...
And just a point on that those figures, those results that are coming up on screen were at that time Trump was speaking last night. They're not the current ones. So Paul, getting back to the main points that we observed there, or we're in, to digest from Trump's position there. Once again, can you unpick that for us, please?
Yeah, and so he's addressing something that I was about to say, which is that the view of the experts in the matter is that mail-in ballots, absentee ballots, will favor Democrats for a variety of reasons, and they have, again, fairly sophisticated methodologies behind that. Trump knows that. And so I believe that when Trump came out, he knew that as the absentee ballots, the very valid absentee ballots that were being counted after midnight were not going to favor him. And so at that point, he started talking about fraud. The trouble is that he has no legal grounds to stand on so long as those ballots were postmarked or received by midnight on election day.
Yep.
Or 8 p.m. or whenever the polls close. So, and what my understanding is that he actually went on, or his surrogates went on to say that they wanted the ballots to continue to be counted in Arizona, where he was behind.
Yep.
But they didn't want them counted in Pennsylvania because most of the absentee ballots were coming from the Philadelphia area, which is heavily Democratic in orientation.
And
both.
Forgive me for, jumping into that dangerous territory of being cynical on this, but could you define any logic to that apart from self-interest?
No. No.
So I'm quite justified in this, in the cynicism about the move.
Oh, you're a wily old dog, so you have reason to be cynical. No, but he's grasping at straws. I guess that's the bottom line, because the counting of absentee ballots clearly now shows a swing in Biden's direction.
Yep.
It's been most dramatic in Michigan, where as the count's gone on, Biden went from being behind to being ahead, and now is pulling away. And so if the same occurs...
The Trump camp knew this, yeah. They were expecting. They knew their counties. They knew what effect the postals and the early votes we're going to have on them in those.
Look at their best strategy, I think, at this point. And I don't like to even talk about people who cheat and to play loose with the rules, but their best strategy is to legally contest all the absentee ballots in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. They can let the rest of the country go because it's going to fall more or less. Yes, there's been a flip in Arizona. Georgia and North Carolina should go Republican. And there's some interesting things to unpack with those states, even in spite of...
They're close, aren't they? At this point, let's bring it up. Let's bring it up on screen. We can play around with some of these things you're talking about in a visual sense. And you can steer this as well as myself if you like. Just bring it up on screen here. Now, this is 538.com, of course, Nat Silver's site, heavily affiliated with ABC. So some of these, you can see the red and the blue on there and things like that. I can actually manipulate this from my end, if you like, Paul. So if we were looking at where shall we start here? Let's bring in and bring in Michigan as won by Biden, because ABC is calling that. Now you see the electoral college votes starting to adjust there. It just takes a few seconds. If we leave Georgia and we leave North Carolina sitting there just for a moment, we've got Nevada for Biden at the moment. Now that's going to be tightened up as far as the calling of that state later on. But the guess is, and I think you support me in this area, that Nevada looks like it'll go Biden, yeah?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So we get down to Arizona, and you've lived in Arizona for a significant amount of time. You've got a lot of contacts in there and a lot of friends. My guess is it is going to come through on for Biden once all of the final count is done. The counties that are strong for Biden are certainly yet to be finished counting there with these. And if you agree, I'll turn that into a Biden blue.
Yes, I'll agree. All I'll say is that there's some interesting demographic shifts that have underpinned this swap from red to blue in Arizona. And many people think about the young Hispanic vote, which did come out in larger numbers in the urban areas of Phoenix, Tucson, and Flagstaff. But many people, particularly those of us overseas, don't know that Arizona has been inundated by Californians in the last 2 decades. Californians who are fleeing very expensive real estate prices, even fleeing earthquakes. Arizona doesn't have earthquakes. And
this is turning Arizona more blue on that demographic pool, yeah?
Yeah, that's the underpinning reasons. High tech has discovered Arizona, a place with a beautiful climate. I mean, yes, it gets hot in summer, but it's absolutely balmy in most of the winter. And high tech, Silicon Valley startups and whatnot have moved to the Phoenix metropolitan area. Tucson is a university town and now has all sorts of tech spin-offs. And so it's no longer a ranching state, this old rural Barry Goldwater type state.
Yeah.
So that may get locked in. That's my key point here. That may get locked in. But let's look at Georgia and North Carolina. I think they're both going to go.
So, but do you want me to color Arizona blue, or would you like to just? Yes.
Yeah, yes, please.
Yeah.
Biden is up by 3 points, 51 to 47, thereabouts, with about 300,000 votes left to be counted. So the math tells you that Trump will have to secure 90% of those votes in order to overcome Biden's lead. So I think Biden is safely will win those electoral college votes. But this is where we get to decide where Trump should win. I think that Trump will win Georgia, albeit closely, and the same will hold true for North Carolina.
So we'll color those red on that basis.
Yeah, yes, let's do so. And that's an interesting looking map. You're now starting to see the great division, the great divide in the United States in stark relief. What we have to understand, though, is that except for the 2nd District of Nebraska, 2nd Congressional District of...
And I'll point out for the viewers here, we have factored in the Democrat win in this Nebraska 2, and also Maine 2 for Trump. So those college votes have been locked in here. At the moment, as you can see, 270 college votes for Biden on this so far, with 248 for Trump. So I'll get back to you. Okay, Paul. Sorry, I just had to intercede on that one.
Yeah, no problem. No, so the only places in the United States where there's proportional allocation of electoral college votes are those 2 congressional districts, one in Nebraska and one in Maine. The entire country otherwise is winner take all. So you can win by 100 votes and you get both of the electoral college votes, or whatever number there are. Sorry. So it's winner take all. Now, North Carolina and Georgia will go to Trump and he will get the electoral college votes. What is disguised by that winner take all approach is that in Georgia in particular, the margin of victory for the Republicans is narrowed considerably because of the upsurge in particularly African American voters who are younger and are there to stay. I mean, this time around, they have gotten close. You see, Georgia will elect a Democrat if he or she is a son of the South. Well, I don't know about she, but, a guy like Bill Clinton. But otherwise, they're a solid Republican shoo-in for the presidency. And here, Biden got very close.
And even on that, as we would say down under, that's a kick in the guts for Trump. Even if Trump pulls it off by a narrow lead here.
Right. That's a place that he had to go back and campaign when he shouldn't have had to waste resources on a guaranteed state. And it's also kicking the guts for the Republican Party as a whole. And that's part of my thought today, this morning, as we get up, is the Republican Party has to look at this, even though it looks like they're going to retain the Senate, and look at that demographic change in places like Arizona. Look at that demographic change, at least in the voting, demographic in places like Georgia, and that's their future. That's what they're looking on the time horizon. And if they don't adjust and accommodate so that they can appeal to these voters in a non-Trump way. You see, once Trump's gone, a lot of the craziness of a cultural sort is also going with him. Then they're going to be in limbo for quite a while. So I think that if we unpack the overall results, we see trends that are, in fact, more favorable to the Democrats than the strict counting of votes under this particular system would lead us to believe.
Okay, so let's in a few minutes, let's look at the institutions of governance in the United States and where they're going. Obviously, the House of Representatives, the Senate, and certainly the administration, and how you feel, depending and determined by the end-up results in those others, how the potential Biden administration may be affected by that. But first off, before we leave this map, we've got Pennsylvania sitting there. It's favoured to go blue on this probability, particularly influenced by what we've ticked so far. But let's look and see what happens if Trump actually turns this over, even if it was through the courts. So it should have adjusted there. So even if Trump wins Georgia, he wins North Carolina, and he wins Pennsylvania, he's too short.
He is indeed. And this is part of the reason that I say that the way things stand right now, depending on your perspective, this is the second worst possible outcome for this election.
It's close, but
that's just it.
Yeah.
And we've talked about this before. The hope, secretly, amongst many political strategists, was that if not a landslide, there would be a significant margin one way or the other.
Yeah.
And that way, people, you couldn't contest every single result. You're like, even if we challenge all these absentee ballots, the fact is there's not enough there to overcome, let's say, a 5-point lead or a 6-point lead. This scenario that you have up there makes it very, very close, which means that the legal challenges and whatnot will come fast and furious from the Republican side. And then let's not downplay the fact that right now there are MAGA protesters inside of the vote counting headquarters in Detroit, Michigan, demanding that they stop the count.
Yeah.
I mean,
without a legal basis having been ruled to do so. So
he has appealed to them to hit the streets.
Yeah.
So far, I've heard nothing about armed people hitting the streets, but you have people going in to counting zones. There's no police to be seen. That was another thing. Is where's the security?
Yeah.
And they're trying to intimidate the vote counters
So
in a place fully democratic. So this is not a good outcome, being so close. And it's more than just that the states is very polarized. It's that it opens the door to all sorts of nefarious interpretations as to what went on. I'll give you, for example, even though Arizona is looking very good for Biden, there are people on the Republican side who said, well, how is it that it can be relatively close at the presidential level, and yet Mark Kelly is going to beat Martha McSally in the Senate race by more than 10 points? Ooh,
Yep.
that's a discrepancy. So, it gives oxygen to conspiracy theorists, to,
Yeah.
who just want to play loose. And so even if Biden wins, from my perspective, being the preferred choice, it's not a good outcome. It
So
simply is not.
what I've done on that is while you were illustrating the dangers of a close race, once again Pennsylvania is right in scope here for both challenges for the presidency. Yeah? And I've factored that in as a Biden win eventually here. And that shifts the Electoral College up for Biden to 290, with Trump descending back down to 248. Does that give Biden the opportunity to actually present a call for a unified United States, like he did this morning New Zealand time, early afternoon US time, where he said he was confident that he is going to come through and that he and Kamala Harris have won this election? His call was something that was echoed here in New Zealand only a couple of weeks ago, that he will be the president for all United States citizens, that as far as he was concerned, should he win the presidency, that the United States will be united. They won't be a mix of blue and red states, of which he will only represent the blue. So it was definitely a call of unity. Do you see that if he wins Pennsylvania, that there is a momentum to his call there?
Well, certainly if he can expand his lead in the Electoral College. It doesn't give him a mandate, but it does give him the opportunity to appeal to some sense of unity. Now, let me tell you quite frankly, that the idea that he can unify all Americans, given how that map looks, that horse bolted a long time ago. The United States will not unify.
Was it ever?
Joe.
Was it ever?
Well,
unified?
moments of unification in the past. I mean, there's been, there have been. No, even Ronald Reagan was able to bring, disgruntled Democrats into the fold. That's not happening. It's done. The United States, I keep on saying this, there's no center anymore. And Biden will appeal to it because that's the moral and ethical thing to do. But you know what his appeal is about? He's appealing to the Republican Party in Congress, to the Republican National Committee, to say, look, we've gone through not only a very, very unpleasant election, but quite frankly, in terms of partisanship, a very unpleasant 4 years plus. And this is an opportunity for us to find some sort of common ground. Let's say, for example, with the Affordable Care Act, we need to address climate change. Again, under Trump, that was not going to happen. The Republicans in Congress, they know the realities of the situation. It's just they've been too afraid to challenge Trump because of the effect it would have on their own careers. If Biden wins, that appeal that he made this morning is more to them than it is to the American public. The American public, I mean, we have the very real scenario. We're going to wind up with Obama 2, with a Congress that just opposes him, that is disloyal, that does everything to stymie Biden's policy initiatives. And what I think is important is that if he can win enough votes in the Electoral College to show that it wasn't close, that in fact, and we know that in the popular vote, he's going to wind up, not only has he received the most votes ever of any American president, more than 70 million, but he could well win the popular vote, this is Biden, by 5 million votes or more. And that'll wind up being a 3 to 4% popular vote margin.
Because he's already over the 700.
Oh, yeah, he's well over 7. this point.
Well over 70 million here. He was speaking to that point as a first ever.
Yeah,
I was
first
happy
time
to achieve
anyone
that.
70 million. All right, Trump. Look at Trump has 66 million plus. So let's not discount the fact that he remains hugely popular in red states. Now, Texas, another example of what I call the Georgia syndrome. The Democrats got very close to winning the presidential election in Texas. They got quite close in a number of congressional seats and whatnot, and they've actually won a few. So again, Texans need to think about their changing demographics. Texas Republicans need to think about that when looking towards it.
That brings to mind, Paul. There's been a lot of debate about the Hispanic, the Latina vote in the United States, and some kind of arguing prior to the vote, prior to the election, that should be seen as one. And it seems to me that that's foolish. The Cuban vote in Miami and in Florida in general, votes obviously quite different to what the Hispanic vote does in California and what we're seeing in Arizona. As I understand, in Arizona, they're a well-oiled machine there, really looking through how do we provide solutions for those that are finding it difficult to get out there and vote type of thing on the ground. So can you just talk it through, because this is a specialist area of yours clearly. So what's going on there, and how should we view that type of consideration on party lines going forward into the future?
The point is very well made. I'm glad you realize it. And yeah, thanks for allowing me to talk a little bit about it. It's an insult to say that Hispanics are homogeneous in their voting preferences. I take offense to that. The fact is that Hispanics, if you just look at Latin America, come in many persuasions. I mean, Dominicans are not Chileans, are not Argentines, are not Mexicans. Brazilians speak anyway. It's it's. Now here's the thing.
And even ideologically, on the state of origin for many is so diverse on the continent, isn't it?
Precisely. And here's the thing. I mean, and we can use the Trump campaign. So Trump decided to start accusing Biden of being a socialist, and Kamala Harris of being, a closet communist.
This is in Florida in particular, isn't it?
Well, the only places where that resonated was with the Cuban Americans in South Florida and the Tampa area, and then recently arrived conservative Venezuelan exiles who have fled the Chavez Maduro regime.
Makes sense. Yep. You can see it. Yeah.
But they're the only people, when you say the word socialism, they freak out. If you go to Tucson, if you go to El Paso, if you go to San Diego, and you talk to Hispanics there, they tend to be Mexican Americans, some of whom have 300 histories in that part of, they were there first. I mean, let's be honest. They don't respond to those sort of appeals. They come from states, I mean, sure, the Cubans and the Venezuelans flee what they call communist dictatorships. I mean, I'm a little pedantic about that, but left-wing authoritarians is the proper way. But if you think about Salvadorians, Hondurans, Guatemalans, Argentines back in the day, Chileans back in the day, they fled right-wing dictatorships. And so these anti-communists, that sort of Cold War appeals do not resonate with them. Now, other issues might. People say, well, the Hispanics are all Catholic. I'm a Catholic, all right? And I've been to church in 30 years. I mean, many Hispanics are about practicing Catholic to what I am.
You might have a friendly Pope back in the Vatican that will say, come home, Paul.
He's Argentine.
Exactly.
He's Argentine.
Yeah.
No, I was actually waiting for a lightning bolt to come out and...
Well, there's been a few plagues hit the United States and disasters that may be coming,
Look at one of the people I was watching the elections with last night turned and said something to the effect, what is that passage in Genesis that right before the apocalypse there's plagues of locusts? Anyway, it was very fun. Because
Yeah.
if you go look at the United States, those Christian evangelicals might be right. The apocalypse might be to arrive in the persona of Joe Biden. But because I don't subscribe to those sort of theocratic views, I think Biden will not be one of the riders of the apocalypse. And I think that Hispanics don't see him as such. And so Trump was successful in turning South Florida, particularly the Miami Beach area, the so-called Little Habana, where Cuban and Venezuelan exiles congregate, they went for Trump. It didn't change the overall dynamic of Miami-Dade County, which still went for Biden. But they siphoned votes from Biden. So they did the opposite to what was going on in Georgia and Texas, let's say, where what should have been a shoo-in for Biden actually became much more contested because those appeals resonated with that particular segment of the Hispanic population in that particular part of the country. But elsewhere, people paid no mind to that because they have no fear of socialists and communists and that sort of thing. But I also think that, again, there's a lot to be learned from the Republican side about the changing demographic of the United States. I mean, we've talked about this, but by 2040, the United States is going to be a predominantly brown-colored country.
And that does not necessarily equate to a dominating Democrat Party, does it? That's the basis of what you're talking about here. Do not fall into the mistakes you're saying to people of just thinking Latina, Hispanic vote equals Democrat. It doesn't. Not at all. And you've illustrated that very strongly. Paul, you mentioned in the broadcast here about the security concerns that you have because the divisions in the United States are not addressed by this outcome either way. There's a comment here from Kevin who often comments on our shows. What he's doing here is really showing, I think, some of the concerns that a lot of people have. Do you think there's a possibility of a false flag, and I'd imagine that he's talking about from the Trump camp, being carried out, I'll just bring it up again, sorry, being carried out to justify martial law and no change of leadership? Do you think that? Or do you think that all the ingredients already exist for clashes to occur so that there is some sort of sense of chaos amongst the divisions that would lead to some sort of advantage from Trump, or at least make it very difficult for a President Biden to actually correct?
Well, there's two ways of looking at this. And Kevin's question, I normally, again, under normal circumstances, I would have said, nah, not a false flag. But a really close vote for the presidency. One that leaves, just a 2-point margin or a 2-vote margin in the Electoral College, will see people come out into the streets. And I fear that some of them will be armed, and they'll be encouraged by Trump and his entourage. Now, because the Trump crowd are increasingly desperate and grasping at straws, I'd say that, yes, there is a possibility that they will manufacture some sort of crisis in order to delay the inevitable, because that's the key point here. If the United States is not going to descend into chaos, it still must adhere to the rule of law. And as far as I can tell, the rule of law says that absentee ballots can be counted after Election Day if they're postmarked or delivered by Election Day. So no amount of diversions is going to detract from that fact. But they could sow fear, they could sow chaos, and that'll be problematic. We didn't mention, but one thing that has come up in the last week, it's been leaked out of the Pentagon that the military brass, the Joint Staff, the guys with the stars, they were hoping for a landslide one way or the other.
Yeah, a definitive ruling from the governance executive.
Because they did not want to be dragged into a civil strife, a domestic civil, I won't say war, but conflict.
Yeah.
Now there's a distinct possibility that they will. And anyone who knows the military knows that they do contingency planning for some of the most remote possibilities. And so, I have a strong feeling that they have done contingency planning for exactly what we're talking about, the possibility of large-scale disorder between adherents of Trump and everybody else. And so here's what I think needs to be done. And it can only happen if Biden's lead widens, is that Biden appeals to the Republicans who may have been opportunistically pro-Trump, but understand the dangers of him trying to cling to power by any means, and say to them, look, I will give you assurances that I will not, purge every vestige of what he did policy-wise. We'll negotiate those things rather than just clean slate. But give the assurances to the rest of the Republican Party that things will not, the end is not near because Trump loses, but in the interest, and appeal to them in the interest of peace. That, if you guys can cut bait on Trump, and he did lose fair and square, then we have some room for maneuver. And you know where I saw the first inklings of that? After Trump's speech last night.
With Pence.
Well, Pence was moderate.
He was moderate.
They all look sleep deprived, but you know who wasn't sleep deprived? The Fox News commentators.
Yeah.
And to a person, because I switched over there.
Brave man.
To see how. Well, I switched to see how they would react.
Yep.
And they reacted very poorly. I mean, they were like, that's not on. You can't say the election was a fraud.
So that gives that's reflecting the values base that many conservative Republicans actually enjoy in their own self. Paul, we've got a couple of questions here, and we'll have to cut it off pretty soon here. So I'd just like to bring them in at this point because they're asking you to address a couple of things. The first off is from Jeffrey Lawhead. He says, if Biden wins, do you see him staying centrist, or is there room for Bernie and the left? Bernie as Labour Secretary or no?
No, I do. I think that, Jeff clearly understands that Biden couldn't win without the progressive support that he got from Bernie's followers, Elizabeth Warren's followers, those sort of folk. I would include myself in that crowd. This was too important an election to stand on principle. But to Jeff's point, Biden's going to have to proceed slowly, precisely for what I just said. You don't want to freak out the Republicans to the point that they'd rather stick and fight with Trump. So you assure them that you're not going to do major radical redesigns and what have you, while at the same time trying to appease, and I use that word delicately, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. If he gets enough votes in the Electoral College, if the Republicans understand that Biden is no big threat to them under the current circumstances, then yes, I think Bernie, Labor Secretary, I think both he and Warren deserve cabinet seats. Yeah. I was thinking Bernie for education. Warren could go many places. She's not going to get Treasury. I mean, Wall Street will flip out.
Right.
But she certainly deserves a cabinet seat. And I don't think that, given that they're very known entities to the Republicans in the Senate, that is not going to send them, through the roof.
Because they know how they tick. Yeah.
They know how they think. They've seen how they vote. They understand what Biden has to do with the left wing of his party. And so, the fact of the matter is that he can make those moves. He just has to proceed with caution.
Okay, you've got someone here I think you may know. Hi, Paul. Jim here, coming in on Lizzie's account. I wanted to tell you your view on the Arizona Cali venom is the first I've heard. Do you think that Miami Latin venom is a tasting thing or is it a thing or is it here to stay?
I'm not exactly sure what the word venom means. What I think is I think that you can trial, if what I'm understanding Jim's point correctly, is that if you appeal to certain parts of the Hispanic population, like the Cubans, in certain ways, you touch their buttons, you can't necessarily translate that to other Hispanic populations. And so I don't think that the strategy that was used in South Florida necessarily will be successful in places like Southern California and Arizona and Texas. And we should also understand there are large, I mean, really large Hispanic populations in places like Chicago, obviously New York, Boston. Those are Puerto Ricans, lots of Mexicans to be sure. They simply vote differently. The phenom, okay, so I just saw.
Yeah, just brought it up. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's it's the phenomena may continue, but again, given that Hispanics are not this homogeneous group, what you can appeal, let's say, just things like abortion. A lot of these people come from countries where abortion is illegal. Women have to resort to back alley, procedures and whatnot. They are not necessarily the so-called right-to-lifers that white evangelical Christians are, because they have a much more intimate experience. What happens when you make such things illegal and force women into the black market of medical surgery? So, again, I think the overall phenomena of Hispanics becoming a more and more important constituency for both parties is absolutely true and is only going to grow. Because again, the Hispanic population is reproducing much, much more than the Caucasian population. And then we haven't even talked about Asians, the Indian American, the subcontinental Indians, who increasingly are a dynamic and yet divided voting bloc. They went both ways in this election. So the overall phenomena is there to stay. How you approach distinct segments of the Hispanic population is a matter of context and contingency.
Okay, Paul, just to wrap this up, what we're looking at here is the map once again. Just wanted to illustrate how important Pennsylvania is from the point of view of addressing some of those concerns that you had relating to underscoring the divisions. So as it stands, if Pennsylvania is won by Trump, and that should adjust, the incumbent does not win the presidency unless it's by way of some addressing one of the other states, like perhaps Michigan in the count, and turns that back into red. But it looks unlikely, and I'm not a lawyer here, but it seems like he's got a long road to go there. If Pennsylvania is won by Biden, then it's not a landslide, but it's a more definitive win. And certainly stronger win than what Trump did in 2016. So just on that point, I'll just hear your view and a concluding view, and then we'll wrap it up and thank our audience.
Yeah, just to finish, here's the thing: whether he wins with Pennsylvania or he barely wins without Pennsylvania, there is a historic moment here, and that is it's very hard to roll, as we say here, an incumbent president. It's a very hard thing. The president has all the advantages of incumbency, all the levers of state power, Air Force One, you name it. And so they are very difficult to dislodge. So whether Biden wins by a little or a lot, it's still a fundamental moment. These are hard things to do. And so I would say, if I was an advisor of his, say, appreciate the moment. Appreciate the fact that, yes, you didn't win by a landslide, but you won. And now you have to be very, very careful with how you approach not only your allies, but your adversaries. In this sense, making some sort of peace with your institutional foes in the Republican Party is far more important than how the popular vote went or the division between red and blue states. So, it's a big moment, even if he wins by a thin margin.
Yeah. On that point, Paul, thanks again. And to the viewers who have been here live, and also including their views and questions, etc., that has been very well received, and thank you for that. We will be back this time next week, Paul and I, to discuss, no doubt, Paul, we haven't discussed it together, but I'm sure it's going to be evaluating the outcome a week out from now. and what that means for people inside the United States and certainly for those nations around the globe as well. So on that point, thank you again for being here and watching this, and also take care out there. Goodbye.